Thank you, Roman, and thank you, all of you, for coming out. By New York standards, this does not seem far from town, but I'm told that it is far in Santa Barbara, so I'm very grateful to you for making the trip. So I want to talk to you today, as Roman said, about a certain kind of human personality, and one that arouses conflicting emotions, and that is someone I'll call the do-gooder. And I don't mean a part-time, normal do-gooder, like someone who works as a social worker or who volunteers once a week at a homeless shelter and then goes back to a normal family life in the evenings. I mean someone who pushes herself beyond what seems reasonable, beyond what normal people consider their duty, to a moral extreme that makes people uncomfortable. And the usual way to help people is to help people around you. When I was writing this book, it was the height of the Ebola epidemic, and I was thinking of the nurses who were ordinary nurses just doing their job, and then suddenly their job required heroism of them. It required working endless shifts for many days. It required risking their own lives every time they went into the hospital. People like that, who are helping people in their community because some need has been thrust upon them, I call heroes. And I don't think anyone has a problem with people like that. And in part because they don't feel like a reproach to the rest of us, because we can always imagine that if we had been a regular nurse in a place struck by Ebola, we would also have risen to the occasion. But the do-gooders, as I'm talking about them, are different from that. They start out with something more abstract. At the beginning of their lives, they start out with a sense of injustice, a desire to live a morally good life. And they don't feel a special obligation to their own people, their own community. They want to help as many people as they can. And they're not better or worse than heroes, but they're rarer, and they're harder to understand. And they are a reproach to the rest of us because they know, as we all know, that there is always somewhere a need for help. And I wrote this book about do-gooders in part because there was something I didn't understand. Why don't the rest of us give more than we do? And I include myself very much in that. This is not a fake question, it's a real question because, as we all know, giving something makes you feel good. And giving something away often makes you happier than keeping it. So it is actually genuinely a puzzle why people don't give more, even if you believe, as I don't, that people are inherently selfish. And the usual answer is that we're human, we're selfish, we're lazy, we love our stuff too much to give it up. And of course, all that's true. But I don't think it's the whole story. I think another reason is that the need of the world seems infinite and overwhelming, and it seems as though to try to do anything serious about it would take a frightening amount of sacrifice. But then there's also the question, what is a good life? Suppose you set out to live a morally serious life. How much should you do? And I think we can all agree that most of us should do more for others than we do, but if you're one of the people that I'm going to tell you about, a serious do-gooder, this actually becomes a very difficult question to answer. When should they stop? Because they're not just giving up things like extra comforts or, extra time, but things that are much more precious, like certain kinds of freedom, like spontaneity. And this is one thing they all confront, and I think it may be one of the most difficult questions of all. If they're giving a lot to strangers, at a certain point this is going to conflict with their desire to give everything they want to their family. And is that right, to give to strangers at the expense of your own people, of the people you love? And to me, in other words, this means what matters most in life. That's the question I want to answer. Small question. Got a few minutes. I want to descend from this abstract level at this point and give you an example of one of the people I wrote about to tell you what I mean. His name is Baba Amte, and he was born in India in 1914. He was a very aristocratic, princely kind of guy, very rich. But he was odd for his, he had no interest in being a rich guy. And one day, he was very macho. This is important. He was very macho. He was always fighting. It was very important to him to be a brave guy who wasn't intimidated by anything. And one day he was walking along a road in the rain, and he saw a leper lying there, almost dead, in the last stages of the disease. And I don't know, you probably haven't seen anyone with leprosy. It's very rare in this country, happily. But it's a really horrifying sight. Flesh crawling with maggots in this case because he hadn't been treated, nose caved in, eyes sunken, toes and fingers gone. And he was horrified by this sight, and he ran away, not wanting to catch the disease. But then, as I told you, this guy was very macho, and he was so appalled that he had been scared, that he had acted like a coward. He forced himself to go back to help the man. There was not much he could do. The man was almost dead. He covered him with a blanket to protect him from the rain. But this affected him so deeply, the thought that he had been a coward, that he decided that the only thing that would restore his sense of self was to steer directly into this fear. And he would make leprosy, he decided, his life's work. And the first thing he did, he had trained as a lawyer, and he decided he had to go to medical school. So he went to a school of tropical medicine in Calcutta. And he was told by a professor there that one of the reasons there was as yet no cure for leprosy was that it seemed to be impossible to transmit the disease from humans to animals for the purpose of experiments. And he thought about this for a day, and then he offered himself as a human experimental subject. And he was injected with the leprosy bacillus, but he didn't catch the disease. We now know that I think something like 99% of humans are immune to leprosy, but they didn't know that then. Now, as it happens, shortly after he graduated from medical school, a cure was found, the drug dapsone. But in India then, as too often now, many people had no access to medical care or didn't go to a doctor until a disease was very far advanced. And so the situation for leprosy patients in India was not that much better after than it had been before, because the symptoms of the disease were so ghastly and so unmistakable that lepers were still cast out of their families, cast out to beg out of their villages. They were sometimes burned alive. And so even though there was a cure now and leprosy patients being treated were not contagious, leprosy colonies were still necessary. And Baba decided to found one. And he was granted some land by the state, an area of tract of wilderness, no crops, a forest, no water, and a lot of panthers roaming around in the woods. And he moved out there with 6 leprosy patients and his wife and their 2 toddler sons, aged 1 and 2, and 4 dogs to protect them from the panthers. And since they had no proper shelter, one by one, each of the 4 dogs was carried off and eaten by a panther at night. Now, I went to visit this. Sadly, frustratingly, Baba and his wife died shortly before I heard of their story, so I didn't get to interview them, but I went to visit this leprosy colony, which is now a flourishing community. I interviewed Baba and Thai's 2 sons, and their 4 grandchildren who are still continuing their work. And it's an extraordinary place. Now something like 3,000 or 4,000 people live there, not just leprosy patients, but also people with other disabilities. There's a school for the blind. There's a college for all kinds of students that the leprosy patients built themselves in the 60s. It's the kind of place where you want to stay. Many people live there their whole lives. They get married there. They have children. But this is the kind of thing I was talking about in deciding between family and strangers. Baba's 2 baby sons did not catch leprosy, but they might have done. And they were not carried off and eaten by the panthers, as the dogs were, but they might have been. And that's the kind of risk he was prepared to take. This conflict between family and strangers came up with everyone that I wrote about, and I'm going to give you, it took different forms, so I want to give you another example to show you what I mean. Sue and Hector Bedeau are a couple who met in high school. They were girlfriend and boyfriend in high school in Vermont. And Sue, when she was little, had read a book called A Family Nobody Wanted, about a couple who had adopted a family of, I think, 10 kids of many different races, even though they'd had very little money. And she'd always loved this idea. She thought it sounded like such fun to have a huge family and to take in kids who had no parents and give them a loving home. And she always wanted to do that. And so when she and Hector decided to get married, they decided that this would be their plan. They would have 2 biological kids, and they would adopt 2. And they got married right out of college, and within a very short amount of time, they had 2, and they adopted 2. They adopted a boy named Jose from El Salvador. There was then a terrible civil war going on there, and they adopted a premature infant from India. But then they became involved in the adoption community, and they realized how many children there were in the United States who would very likely never have parents, because there were many children that nobody seemed to want to adopt, either because they were too old, or they were too sick, or they were the wrong race that people didn't want, or they had too many brothers or sisters. Very few people wanted to adopt more than one kid at a time. And they thought about these kids going from foster home to foster home to foster home throughout their lives and never having parents, and they couldn't bear it. So they decided to start adopting more. They adopted Joelle, who was an 8-month-old baby girl from Florida who had fetal alcohol syndrome and had been born weighing 2 pounds, so her health was quite precarious. And at one point they went on vacation to an adoption conference, this was their idea of vacation, in New Mexico, and they learned about sibling groups as a special problem, that even if the siblings were in perfect health and they would probably never get adopted, or if they were adopted, they would be adopted into different families because no one wanted to take on the burden of several kids at once. So they were looking through an adoption newsletter, and they saw a family of 4 Hispanic kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, and they decided to adopt them. And after those 4 came, they had, 9, and they didn't think they were going to adopt anymore, but then they heard about this woman heard about them. She read about them in the paper. It was a white woman in Vermont who'd had a son with a black father, and she wanted her son to be adopted, but she didn't want it to be in a family with only white people. And she read about Sue and Hector's family, which was already multiracial, and she asked them to adopt her son, and they brought him in. And then the next year, they got another copy of the adoption newsletter, and they read about 6 teenagers, also from New Mexico, who had had an unspeakably traumatic childhood. And they saw that already the 2 eldest teenagers of the 6 had aged out of the system because they were, I don't think it's even 18, it was younger than 18. And they realized that the chances of these 6 being together in one family was almost nil, so they adopted all 6. And after that, they started, previous to this, they had thought their special thing, the kids they felt most moved to help were kids with emotional problems and older kids. But then social workers started coming to them with kids that were very sick, and knowing that no one else was going to adopt them. It was either them or an institution. And they adopted 4 kids who were very sick, including 3 who were going to die very young. And they ended up adopting 20 kids in addition to their 2 biological kids. And at first, when they were at the earlier stages of adopting these 20, it was fun and it was easy, and the kids were very welcoming. They thought, new small kids were kind of exciting, were cute, and big kids were exciting, and it was just more kids to play with, and it was fun. But then as the family grew bigger and bigger, the kids started to get resentful, and the older kids were being asked to help out with the younger kids, and there was never enough attention, never enough time, never enough money. They had no money. And one of the teenagers, for instance, Trish, said, I'll quote her, "We got to a point where we were like, all right, Dad and Mom, you've got to stop adopting. Some of us got tired of it. We felt like we were helping to take care of everybody. I would feel bad because I would think to myself, how would I feel if they didn't want to adopt me because they thought we had too many kids? But I would still feel like that's enough." And I think this is the difference between Sue and Hector and an ordinary parent. I think, I must emphasize, this is a family. This is not an orphanage. So kids pleading with them, saying, I feel like I'm not getting enough of your attention. I feel like this family is too big. For an ordinary parent, that would be the end of it. But for Sue and Hector, although this wounded them, they couldn't stop thinking about the children out there who were still strangers to them. And so they decided that even though it would mean less attention, less time, less money for the children they already had, if it transformed the life of a child outside who coming into the family, then it was worth it. And they never told themselves also something that many of us do, which is, well, someone else will adopt these other children, because they knew it wasn't true. Now, mind you, there were many children that they did not adopt. They weren't, I really want to emphasize, these are not crazy people. They did not adopt every kid they saw. but they knew themselves that they could provide a family for a lot of kids, and they wanted to do it for as many kids as possible. And then it got very difficult. When the kids were younger, it was easier, and then as they got older, the troubles began, and especially with the 6 teenagers who were already in their mid and late teens. The pregnancies began. First, all the girls in the teenage group got pregnant. And then one of the boys got 3 different girls pregnant and was sent to jail for drugs. Then some of the younger kids who had been with them for longer got pregnant. And one by one, each of the girls did. And this wounded them, especially because, as you can imagine, these are people whose whole life purpose is to prevent children from being born into a home that's not ready for them, to make sure that each child has a stable home. And so this really destroyed them. And especially when the last 2, Hector in particular, was sure that Chelsea, their first child, and Joelle, the fetal alcohol syndrome baby girl who had been adopted, weighing 2 pounds, the 5th child they had, he was sure that they would be careful because they were particularly ambitious. They were both in college. And when they became pregnant before they were married, he really lost it. He started to cry. And he left the house. And they were at that point living in Philadelphia. He got on the train, and he rode on the train all the way to New Jersey, all the way to Trenton, and back and forth. He just bought a ticket and went back and forth, and he spent the whole day crying, wondering how could he have messed up so completely? Why was it that he and Sue, his wife, had not been able to get even one girl to understand the importance of not becoming pregnant until you had a stable family? But then he came home, and at the end of the day, he realized, who am I to cast stones? I have done many terrible things myself. And he came home, and it's a long story. I won't tell you all the other difficult things that happened. Many difficult things happened in this family, but the bottom line was, and in the hard times, it was hard for him to realize this, but the bottom line was that despite everything, all of these children were better off for being in their family than they would have otherwise. For instance, Lily, the oldest of the girls among the 6 teenagers, after she got pregnant, she did drop out of college, but she went to work at the Cabot Creamery factory in Vermont, and 20 years later, she was still there. She had been with the same man for a long time, and she was very happy there. She had been promoted to manager, and often she told her parents how much better her life would be than it would have been if she wasn't part of the family. And the other kids, many of the other kids achieved success too. Joelle had a steady job supervising special needs kids in schools. Chelsea was the director of a website for a large company. Jose, the first child they adopted from El Salvador, was a computer programmer in a bank in Zurich. And the question many people ask me is, well, but wouldn't the children have been better off if they'd adopted only 1 or 2? And the answer may be yes. To me, though, the question is, would the children they did adopt have been better off if they hadn't been adopted? And I think the answer is definitely not. But still, these are difficult choices to make. And when I started writing about lives like these, I knew that people would disagree about the right thing to do, whether it was right for Baba and his wife to put their 2 toddlers in such danger, and whether it was right for Sue and Hector to keep adopting children who are strangers to them, even though it would mean less time and money and attention for the kids they already had. I knew that people would disagree about the right thing to do. But what I didn't expect when I was starting to write this book was that there were a lot of people who didn't actually admire extreme moral commitment at all. I discovered there are various cliches about this sort of person that get in the way of, I think, seeing them straight. So one is the idea that there's goodness and good people is kind of boring and simple and insipid. There's this cliche that evil is fascinating and complex and goodness isn't. And I was talking to a novelist I knew at one point because I was looking in fiction for characters that resembled the people I was writing about, and I couldn't find them. And I said, why is it that you novelists don't write about these people and these very good people? And he gave me this look of total contempt, like I'd asked him to, why don't you write a sweet, lovely novel about bunnies and butterflies? And he just couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in goodness. On the other hand, and this of course contradicts the first cliche, something like half the people I spoke to about this book as I was working on it said, oh, those people, they're all mentally ill, right? And I said, well, no, but that's so interesting, you should say that. And I became actually quite fascinated by this hostility and this skepticism about very moral people. And I ended up tracing a kind of history of it in our culture, because I don't think it's always been this way. But I looked at the past couple of hundred years, and I think there's sort of two strains of thinking. First, it came to seem that helping people was much more difficult and liable to backfire than had previously been thought. And then the motives for helping people came to seem much more complicated and suspect than they had before. And the result of that is, I think, living an ethical life has come to seem less appealing than it once did. So just to give you a quick tour of this history, for instance, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in the 18th century, it argued that a man pursuing his own selfish ends, self-interested ends, in combination with many other people doing the same thing, could end up bringing about as much and maybe more public good as somebody who was trying to do that on purpose. And this was actually a very small part of The Wealth of Nations, but it was a very resonant metaphor, this idea of the invisible hand curating all this selfishness to produce public good. And it implanted very deep in Western culture the idea that if the goal were helping others, a selfish man might even do better than a selfless one. And a century later, Darwin's Origin of the Species introduced the idea that the selfish struggle for survival was the basis for life itself. Now, Darwin himself did not believe this. He believed that altruism could be explained perfectly well by natural selection, because communities that cooperated with each other, that helped each other, would prosper more than communities just full of selfish individuals that did not cooperate. But among biologists, this explanation was not, in general, thought to be convincing. And for about a century after the Origin of the Species, altruism was explained away by other ideas. It might be kin selection. You appear to be helping others, but you're actually just propagating genes by helping your family. Or reciprocal altruism. You seem to be helping somebody else for selfless reasons, but actually you're doing it in expectation that that person will help you back. So the idea that selfishness might produce better results than selflessness arose first. And then in the 20th century, this second idea that I mentioned came about, the idea that selflessness might not just be ineffective, but that there was something twisted about it, something aggressive, something perverse. For instance, there's this wonderful book, The Gift, by a French anthropologist called Marcel Mauss, which was published in 1925. And Mauss studied several archaic societies. And in these societies, he noted giving was not at all the selfless act that it was thought to be in the West. It was thought to be, especially giving without the expectation of anything in return, which we usually think of as a higher act, less selfish act, was actually the opposite, because by giving something without expecting return, you were setting yourself up as superior to the person you were giving whatever it was to. And you were causing that person to lose face and imposing a burden of gratitude on that person. And in some languages that Mauss studied, a gift, there was another word for a gift that was unreciprocated, and that word was poison. And Freud also set the tone in psychoanalysis and psychiatry for decades when he characterized what he called excessive altruism as moral masochism. And his daughter, Anna Freud, who was also, of course, a famous psychoanalyst, was even more hostile towards altruism than he had been. She coined this term altruistic surrender to describe the perverse mental state of a person who couldn't achieve gratification directly and so had to achieve it through a proxy. But this altruism, this suspicion of altruism existed not just in the social sciences and intellectual culture, but in popular culture as well. And here again, I'm just going to give you a couple of steps on the road. There are many different sources for this, but one I became very interested in was Al-Anon. As you know, Alcoholics Anonymous popularized the notion in the 1930s and after that alcoholism was not a sin, but a disease. And Al-Anon, which is the group founded by the spouses of alcoholics in the 1950s, spread the related idea that trying to help an alcoholic was not a virtue, but actually part of the same disease. And the alcoholic and the helper, the person who was trying to help him give up drinking, were enmeshed in the same in a kind of psychological folie à deux. And these were both very radical ideas, but it was the second one that was actually had stranger and more far-reaching implications because, if alcoholism is a disease or if it's a sin, either way it's a bad thing. But if trying to help someone, specifically an alcoholic, to give up drink is part of the same disease, then a whole species of behavior starts to look very different. And this idea spread much more widely throughout the culture a couple of decades on in the 1970s when a term was coined, codependency. And this spread this concept to all kinds of people who were trying to help others change to become a different sort of person. It now was characterized as not helpfulness, but controlling, a kind of power struggle, an attempt to force someone to be what you thought they should be rather than what they themselves wanted to be. And it looked neither virtuous nor even genuinely helpful. And I read a lot of psychiatric articles about altruism in the course of doing this book, and most of them fell into this mold of pathologizing altruism in various ways. And most of them I really didn't, they didn't ring true to the kind of people I was meeting, but there was one theory that really did strike me, which is the theory of the parentified child. The idea here is that a child who grows up in a family in which at least one parent is non-functional as a parent, either because he or she is an alcoholic or severely mentally ill, obviously normally this just messes the child up. But in some cases, the child will become parentified, will try to make up for the absence of this parent, will try to fix his family. He might become the perfect student. He might learn how to cook dinner or take care of the parents, take care of the younger siblings, just clean the house, somehow fix his family. And the idea is that this kid, when grown, will be driven to fix the world in the way that he tried to fix his family as a child. And at first, when I heard this theory, I thought, this is just another one of these pathologizing theories. But then I thought about the people I wrote about in the book, and I realized that not all of them, but almost all of them fall into this category. And so I do think there's something to that. But on the other hand, I still don't think that that means necessarily that this kind of altruism is a pathology. Because imagine another child who's raised in a lovely family with two wonderful parents who love her and raise her to believe that you should help others because it's the right thing to do. That child is going to grow up feeling just as strong a sense of obligation and duty to help others as the first. And I wonder if a sense of duty that comes from bad parents is any less true or free than a sense of duty that comes from good parents, if they have the same effects. Interestingly, as I said, I was looking, as I was meeting these people, I was looking in fiction for fictional versions of them to get a sense of how these people have been represented in culture, and I was having trouble finding them. That novelist I told you about is not alone, and it's actually been really interesting since I published the book. Several novelists and one playwright have come up to me and said, I am trying to write about a character like this, and it's so difficult. And these are not new novelists. These are people who've published many, many books, And so it's not that they are new to the form. They said to me, it's as though there's something resisting. I can't make it work. It doesn't sound right. I can't make a novel out of a character like this. And it did, after reading many, many books, and I went to look for the novelist I thought was the most likely to write about such a character, like Eliot or Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Graham Greene or Iris Murdoch or lots of, the novelists that you think of as interested in moral questions. And it was very striking that actually in novel after novel, insofar as there were these characters at all, there was a case made against them. They were punished for a kind of spiritual hubris, a kind of attempt to escape from human suffering. It was as though there was an implicit ethos in fiction that human failure and human flaws were more deeply human than goodness. And so goodness had to be punished for its attempt to escape the human condition. And I found it very striking because we usually, insofar as we think about fiction and morality, I think I often read that fiction is supposed to promote morality because it makes us empathize with people who are different from us and enter into their shoes, and so we're supposed to then want to help them more or something like that. But actually, I think it's as though there's something the opposite. There's something in fiction that pushes against morality, which is odd because many novelists are driven by moral rage, but it's as though they would rather show the thing that enrages them, but not a character trying to fix it. And I'm guessing that as I'm saying this, maybe some of you are trying to think of counterexamples, so I just want to knock a few of them down, who I don't think count for various reasons. So Prince Mishkin in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, for instance, he, I think, and other Dostoevskian characters fall into the same category, is more of a holy fool. He's an innocent. He's not the kind of ambitious moral striver that I am talking about. And many of the moral characters, as I said, are punished, are made to seem kind of repellent so that you can't take them seriously. Like if you've read Jonathan Franzen's novel Freedom, I find Walter, for instance, completely repellent. Or they're weak, or they die young, like George Bernanos' Country Priest. Or they're completely ridiculous, like Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House. And even Dorothea in Middlemarch, who is most often held up to me as a counterexample, if you read the preface, George Eliot describes her as a foundress of nothing and emphasizes that despite a kind of grandeur of spirit and a good heart, she gets nothing done in her life. And I don't think that's incidental. I think that is central to the way that novel works, that if she were more ambitious and actually did pursue the projects that she thinks about, it would be a very different novel and it wouldn't work in the same way. And this became another reason that I wanted to write this book, is a sort of message to fiction writers. I wanted to show that there can be a beauty and a grandeur to a rigorously moral life, and that goodness can be just as complex and just as fascinating, and even sometimes as terrifying as evil. Now, it may seem odd after what I've told you about Baba Amte and Sue and Hector, but actually all the do-gooders in my book who managed to make a real life of their moral commitment do so by finding limits that they can live with. They want to maintain their commitment over the long haul, not just do something big and then crash and burn. And so I want to tell you, as an example of this, about another young couple I met. Well, this is a young couple. I met them in their mid-20s, Julia and Jeff. And Julia had believed from when she was quite small, like many of us believe when we're quite small, that she's no more valuable or important than anyone else in the world, and so she therefore believed that it was unjust that she should have any more than anybody else. And she struggled with this. What should she do with her life? How should she address this injustice? And the first thought she had when she was in college, many people have this thought, is I should be a foreign aid worker. But then she read some more about foreign aid work, and she thought, actually, it was a very humble realization. She thought, I'm just some American. Am I really going to go out into some third world country and blunder around, knowing nothing, attempting to do good for people who I don't know well? She thought, no, actually, I can probably do more good. It's not about myself and my glamorous, risky career. If I'm humble about it, she thought, I should probably stay home, earn a first world salary, and send the money to a local NGO that actually knows what it's doing. So she decided that that's what she would do, and she decided to give as much as she possibly could. And when she first made this decision, it made her life an absolute misery, because she wanted to give as much as she could. And so every time she went to the supermarket, she would agonize over like every jar of peanut butter, it's $5, and for $5 I could buy, 10 bed nets that might save a child's life, or a cereal, what could she buy? It was impossible. And it was another person I spoke to of the same kind of way of thinking. The way he put it was, no one would buy a soda if there was a starving child standing next to the vending machine. Well, for me, there was always a starving child standing next to the vending machine. But she realized this was stupid, that she was going to drive herself insane, and she would never be able to live like this. So she figured out a system with her husband where they would set aside a certain amount of money to be spent on food and et cetera per week, and then they would give the rest away. And it was usually 50 to 75% of their income that they gave away. But because they were in their mid-20s, and this was a wonderful privilege about meeting with them and talking with them about their moral lives at this point in their life, they had to make two big decisions. Or really, Julia had to make these decisions, because Jeff, her husband, was okay either way. She had to decide what she should do for work, and she had to decide whether or not to have a child. And she wanted to be a social worker. She'd wanted to for a long time, and she thought she would be good at it. But as we know, social workers don't earn very much. And she'd gone to a good college, and she knew she could become a corporate lawyer and earn 10 times as much and give 10 times as much away. And so she thought, well, is it okay to consider my happiness? Is it morally justifiable to become a social worker because I want to do it? And is there any difference in declining to earn all that extra money that I could give away, and earning it and spending it on fancy clothes and fancy vacations? Not really. From her point of view, from the point of view of the people receiving the money, no difference. So this was a struggle, and she thought about it for a long time, and then finally she thought, if I become a corporate lawyer, I'll be so miserable that I will burn out and I will not be able to maintain my commitment for the long haul. And so she decided to go into social work. And similarly with children, she thought, well, I'm going to be a very frugal mother, frugal to the point of weirdness, but inevitably I will spend money on a child if I have a child that would otherwise have been given away. And so by having my own child, I will in effect be killing other people's children who would be saved by the money I would donate. And as you can imagine, put that way, it was quite a struggle for her. Luckily, Jeff, who is a computer programmer, came up with an algorithm whereby he assessed the predicted contribution of the future child to charities. He thought, well, most children have approximately the views of their parents, but they regress to the mean to some extent. It probably wouldn't give quite as much as we did, but supposing it gave a little bit less than we do and it made a certain amount of salary, then we could predict. He calculated that on the whole, it was likely the child would give more to charity than it would cost to raise the child. And to many people this sounds insane, but to Julia that made perfect sense. And so now they have 2 children and are very happy. But this was a tough choice. So, as you've seen, in all these different ways, this choice between family and helping strangers has come up for everyone I spoke to. And I think this is yet another reason why there is such skepticism about such people, because I think for many of us, even placing these two in the same balance seems wrong, seems unnatural. There's a philosopher I love, the late Bernard Williams, a British philosopher, who poses this question. He imagines a man standing on the shore, and over there are 2 strangers drowning, and over there his wife is drowning, and the man is asking himself, is it morally acceptable to save my wife? And Bernard Williams said, this man is having one thought too many. It is horrible that he's even asking permission of morality to save his wife. A decent man would simply save his wife without asking whether it was acceptable. And this sounds totally true, and yet it's not quite true, because 2 strangers, that sounds kind of easy, but what about 10 strangers versus your wife or your child or your husband? Or what about 100 strangers? Or what about 1,000 strangers? At a certain point, everyone's going to start to feel guilty, and everyone has a number, and they should. And this is actually not a hypothetical question. It's a question that actually arises in cases such as war. And I think actually this is one of the reasons, I think there are many reasons, as I suggested in that sort of historical sketch I gave you earlier, one of the many reasons that in our moral culture right now we are so skeptical of do-gooders, because I think because we have no conscription in this country and haven't for a long time for a just war. Of course, there was conscription in Vietnam, but that was a very controversial war, one that many people disagreed with. So it's really been since World War II when it has been a completely normal situation in this country for every family to be expected as a matter of course, not as some grand moral achievement, but just normal living, to give up a family member, a husband, a father, a son, for a larger cause that was thought to be just. And I think in the absence of that ordinary sense of public duty, our sense of duty towards our families, towards our children most particularly, has expanded to fill that space that used to be taken up by larger, more public ideals. So I think, as I said, it's not just a matter of selfishness and a matter of liking our stuff that makes us suspicious of such people. I think there is this genuine conflict about what it means to live a good life. And this makes people like Julia and Baba and Hector and Sue all the more remarkable because they buck this. They believe that what they're doing is right, and despite the immense force of the moral culture, and these are not people who come from families who trained them to do this. Their families think they're freaks. They do what they believe is right nonetheless. And sometimes people would ask Sue and Hector in particular, why did they choose this difficult life? Why did they adopt 20 kids? Why couldn't they have adopted just 1 or 2 or 3 kids and had lived a more normal life? And what people didn't understand who asked them that was that it wasn't just the children that they loved. It wasn't in spite of the difficulty of their life that they did it. It was in part because of it. They loved the challenge. And this is one of the most striking things about these people I wrote about, is that, yes, they give up some comforts, and they've chosen very, very difficult things to do. But like other sorts of very ambitious, driven people, they love that challenge, and moreover, they believe that they are living as they ought to. They are doing what they should, and they know that they're changing many lives for the better. And that gives them a deep and happy sense of purpose that very few people have, because how many of us can say that? Thank you.